Yeah, this is a great question. I reckon you could break down the job creation into three different categories. The first is the sort of relatively straightforward one that you mentioned in the question, which is the creation of jobs in the actual transition to a lower carbon economy through building renewable energy and other sort of infrastructure, and you know, even changing jobs where things are done more manually than they used to be. So there's a kind of relatively obvious, when you tease apart where emissions are currently coming from, what's going to be needed to reduce the emissions. But then there's a second category, which is the research and development that will be prompted by a carbon price. So all producers that are currently paying the carbon price will have an incentive to do things differently and to reduce their emissions. And so particularly big business will be employing people in research and development about how they can reduce their emissions, and that there'll be very strong incentives for that. So there'll be quite a lot of jobs in R&D, but actually the biggest part of the job creation is because of the dividend. So this is one of the things that makes the fee and dividend kind of even more appealing, is the fact that, as the University of New South Wales modelling showed, now we haven't got the numbers right in front of me, but I think it was 2/3 of households will be better off than they were before the carbon price. And what the households that will be better off are the lowest income households, lowest income individuals, lowest income families. And as we know from various kinds of stimulus payments, like the $750 that's recently been paid by the government to any government income recipients, to all government income recipients, when you give money to people who are low income, they spend it. And so they tend to, you know, they'll be spending it on goods and services, and not necessarily anything to do with climate change or to do with carbon. The sort of money that they have in addition to how much their expenses rise will be spent on whatever it is they need. And so when that happens in the economy, when they've got a sort of large number of people who have low incomes who are given extra money and they spend it, obviously people have to supply the goods and services, the additional goods and services that those people are then buying. I don't know why my system's just switched away from gallery mode by itself. Okay, it's back. And the result is, you know, higher demand for goods and services means greater production, greater distribution, all those things. And so the result is going to be greater employment, right? Because the economy more broadly is producing and supplying a greater number of goods and services. So this is where, you know, this is where the big numbers come from in terms of extra job creation, is through the stimulus effect of the dividend itself. So you've got those sort of three categories of extra employment. And, you know, the question mentions ongoing jobs outcomes. You know, the end game is zero carbon, zero tax, and then, of course, unfortunately, zero dividend. But we are talking about net zero emissions. So the actual zero emissions in terms of carbon is, you know, it's a very long way away. Even when we reach net zero emissions, there will still be emissions, and they will still be subject to a price. So we're talking kind of very long term that the dividend falls. But the general result of even sort of medium term stimulus is to create a kind of larger economy, and the outcome of that is ongoing. So the stimulus itself, and we see that with government stimulus, particularly when it's counter-cyclical, is that jobs that are created don't just sort of disappear when the stimulus disappears. Often what you've done is you've sort of lifted the economy to a new level. So it's likely that the result will be ongoing jobs. We don't know exactly what those will be because it depends what people spend money on. But of course, in addition, there's just sort of the transition of jobs away from carbon emissions intensive industries towards others. But that's you know, in the short term, there'll be more jobs created than are lost. But in the longer term, it's likely to sort of even out, I would imagine. I guess my key answer to that is to reject the very last part of the question, which is that they have no incentive to become more carbon neutral, because I mean, in the case of farming, it's sort of, there's a combination, I suppose, between the fact that the farmers are consumers as well as being producers, right? So they have consumer power, which will direct them to purchase lower emissions fertilizer, fuel, machinery, more efficient machinery, switching to electric when they can switch to electric, and all of those things. So just like any other consumer, they'll be putting price pressure through the supply chains for their suppliers. But in addition to that, there'll be incentives upon farmers to switch farming practices, and some of those are farming practices which we already know have other benefits, such as what's sort of come under the umbrella of regenerative farming, which is mixed agriculture, where it's more labour intensive but less input intensive, and as a result kind of more broadly sustainable, and the extra labour costs are offset to some extent by the reduced inputs. But with a carbon price, sort of higher labour intensive farming will also become more viable and the produce more affordable. So which also, does a better job of preserving soils, and there's more biodiversity on higher intensive agriculture farms. So that's just one example, I guess, of how there's kind of, I guess I read that question and I couldn't think of an industry where there wasn't an incentive for them to become more sort of to head towards carbon neutrality or to become more efficient or effective. And perhaps you can think of others, but the one that was listed as an example was farming. And I think even in that case, there's a mix between incentive for their behaviour to change, plus for them to act differently as consumers. This is a really great question, and it's a really important point, because the sort of fee and dividend on its own will not achieve sort of justice for those workers who are displaced. And I think, I'm personally of the view that we should take collective responsibility as a nation for all unemployed people, as we did for 25 years after the end of World War II, where unemployment was seen as a collective problem that was actually caused by the system that we'd chosen to adopt, which is a capitalist market-based system. And one of the costs of a capitalist market-based system is the business cycle and unemployment. And the idea is businesses compete to succeed, and if they're competing to succeed, then some fail and some people become unemployed. And I think if we collectively choose the benefits of a capitalist system, then we also actually should take collective responsibility for the costs, and the current costs are unemployment. And we used to do that, and for 25 years the governments were committed to full employment, and up until the early 1970s, Australia averaged 2% unemployment. We could do that again, and I've advocated for some time for a return to an explicit full employment policy federally. That's kind of that's the big answer. The smaller answer is that we absolutely need transition planning for industries, and we need a commitment to looking after people who end up as sort of casualties in what we need to do, in the transition to zero emissions, which we have to do it. And it's unfortunate that there will be quite a lot of people who lose their jobs. But I think as a nation, we have to look after those people. And that means, I reckon, guaranteeing them a job. So that they'll be guaranteed retraining, and if they're willing to work, guaranteed a job. I think it's the best approach. And those jobs can be either in, the new economy, renewable energy, in green industries, or just any government job that needs doing. So, you know, environmental restoration, there's lots of options. And ultimately, you know, it might seem very like that would be extortionately expensive, but the sort of stimulus effect of that on the economy versus letting those people become unemployed is you know, quite great and important. Yeah, Tanya, got a question?
Yeah, just a thought of the universal basic income. Does that come into any of that thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's almost a little turf war amongst progressive economists between people who think we should have a job guarantee versus people who think we should have a UBI. And I think, so just to clarify, universal basic income is money paid universally, which means to everyone, regardless of income, across the population. So in a sense, the dividend from a carbon fee and dividend is like a UBI, except that, you know, the price won't be high enough for people to actually live on it. But the idea of a sort of genuine UBI is that everybody is given enough money that they can always survive. And the advantage of giving it to everyone is that you don't have what we currently have with our welfare system, which is this kind of high effective tax rates, because as people earn more money, so they get less benefit. And so their benefit payment goes down while their income goes up and their taxes are going up. And so they get less of their own take-home pay. The benefit of a universal income is that doesn't happen. You sort of get to keep the money that you earn. Versus a job guarantee, which is where people are guaranteed a job. I'm personally in favour of a job guarantee combined with a guaranteed minimum income. So basically, people who are unemployed or whatever circumstances they're in will always kind of have enough money to survive. You know, I don't believe that any Australian should be living in poverty. So I don't know if that answers your question. But I do think, you know, I think the fee and dividend model appeals to universal basic income advocates because it is a kind of almost like a test case for a UBI. I'm planning, you know, the intention is to give everyone, regardless, the same amount of money. Yeah, so you know, we've got an employment services industry in Australia, which is anything but an employment services industry. It's primarily an industry that's meant to kind of punish unemployed people and make their life a misery so that they will accept any job that comes along. I've spent quite a bit of time working on this and traveled the country talking to unemployed people about their experiences of employment services, and you know, there's the so-called mutual obligations that make people apply for this many jobs and do this many things and come to this many appointments, is sort of routinized hoop jumping that often is completely pointless, particularly in circumstances where there aren't enough jobs for those people. And that was the reality before the coronavirus, was that we had far more unemployed people than we had jobs. And so the reality for many people, particularly living in places where unemployment was very high, was, you know, they were being forced every month to apply for 20 jobs, and the employers were flooded with applications, and most of them were people who were only applying because they had to, and you know, who knew they would never get the job. So we need to reform the whole employment services industry, and I think this is a great opportunity if we're going through a transition like this to create an employment services industry that's genuinely about both the creation of jobs, as it was in the post-war years, and the training of people to fill those jobs that have been created. So that's what I would be angling for, is the creation of jobs, deliberate creation of jobs, so that we can give people a job when they lose them, you know, in the coal industry or gas or whatever else it might be. That was a bit of a rant about employment services. You can tell I feel strongly about it. I mean, there are a lot of different paths to zero net emissions, and you know, one of them is direct government action and direct regulation, and certainly this would be quite plausible in a country that had completely government-owned energy infrastructure, if we hadn't privatized our electricity production and distribution, generation and distribution, then the government could just make it renewable, right? Have a schedule, replace stuff, make it renewable. But because we privatized everything, direct government action becomes a sort of game of working out how much profit the private players are willing to take in order to change what they're doing versus the profit they're currently making. And the outcome tends to be very expensive. You know, the current system that you know, I'm kind of playing a bit of a game here as if the current federal government really wants to make the transition and you know, get to net zero emissions, which I think fairly transparently they don't. And so they've got this system of kind of paying polluters to get rid of low-hanging emissions fruit that they were probably going to get rid of anyway. In a lot of cases, the current system pays companies to do things that they were probably going to do at some time in the medium future anyway. You know, mothball old equipment and so on. But I guess I wanted to be generous about that and say that there are other paths to zero emissions, and we could, you know, the government could just say, all right, well, we've got, here's the, when we have to be 100% renewable, it's got to be done by 2045, and here's the path, and here are the penalties. But ultimately, if you want the creativity of private business and the market, and this is a sort of one of the few times when I'll sound like a standard economist, a carbon price is the best way to do it. You know, you kind of just put the price out there, and it's not administratively difficult. You don't have to have a giant bureaucracy deciding the path and the mechanisms, and which can be done. You know, I'm not a sort of completely anti-bureaucracy kind of a person. It can be done, but we've already seen from the very brief period we had a relatively low carbon price, the impact on emissions, and you know they were coming steadily down during the time that we had that carbon price. And we know if we had a fee and dividend where we could have a much higher price, that you'd have all of the sort of machinery of private enterprise working out how to reduce their costs, and you're sort of distributing it amongst the population and the industries in Australia rather than trying to centralise it. And so it is going to be much more efficient and likely much quicker if you can have a high carbon price. So yeah, I guess that's my answer to that question. But the main one really is about the privatisation of infrastructure and the sort of reduced capacity of government to take direct action because of that, and the sort of complexity of doing it by command. And you know, I guess it's worth pointing out the irony of the situation that we find ourselves in, where the coalition, who nominally are the party that you would expect to be using market mechanisms to correct a problem rather than regulation, have painted themselves into a corner by so vocally and so kind of violently opposing the carbon price that we used to have, and talking about, you know, putting a wrecking ball through the economy and creating $100 roasts of lamb and all that kind of stuff that they went on about back then. That they essentially counted themselves out of the policy solution that most suits their ideology, which is a carbon price. It's just purely through kind of pig-headed opposition to the Gillard government, and so they're stuck in sort of using a policy that actually doesn't suit their ideology and is inefficient and pretty ineffective. And they, you know, the current method they use of just allocating some money and allowing people to bid for carbon emissions. I don't know how much you know about how the current system works, but they have a pool of money and they say, all right, come and tell us how many tons of carbon you can reduce in terms of your emissions for this amount of money. You make a bid, and then they'll award the money to the people who say they can reduce the most tons per dollar. And So that's how the process works. And that's why, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to prove additionality sometimes. So you'll get companies coming to the government proposing to do things that they would have done anyway, and then getting paid for it. And you sort of end up paying the worst of the emitters. So the dirtiest, worst companies are the ones who sort of get rewarded through this system, because they're the lowest hanging fruit. They're the ones that can most easily reduce their emissions. And so there's almost a sort of financial reward for them, because they've had such high emissions production in the past. Yes, but it's got to be sort of like fourth tier. So this, especially lobbying the states, can be effective if you've got pathways in, and the states are of the same party as the feds. That you've got sort of extra power then, because the states do have influence, and they can sort of lobby the feds. But I don't think that's a high priority. But you kind of might as well do it if you've got an easy in. Is my answer, particularly to the relevant minister or to the premiers. Well, I mean, I actually think the answer is the other way around. It's got to be their base pushing them. So, I think the actual party membership, even a majority of them want more action on carbon pricing. And the challenge is that, they've got too many coal and gas lobbyists in their ear and inside their offices. And so, one of the things that CCL are working on is the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which is to actually get business lobbying to start to work on the coalition. And I think that's one of the possible angles. I think there's, we're slowly seeing more of the key people who were in power during that Abbott opposition leaving. So Abbott's gone, Cormann's going. There's going to be turnover, and I guess eventually there might be a chance that there'll be few enough of those who were there then that they'll change policy. But it's not. I don't think it's a bright light. I think we've got to keep the pressure up, and the biggest chance we have is corporate lobbying. And there's a very promising announcement the other day from a large number of Australian corporations saying they want net zero emissions by 2050. So it's not completely hopeless, but I do think it's a very big uphill battle to get this current mob to introduce a carbon price. There's still, it's a bit too close to the campaign the very, very kind of aggressive campaign they ran against the last carbon price. And Morrison is key in that. He's a denialist. He's the man who carried coal into Parliament. It's getting him to turn around is a big ask. Well, it pretty much aligns with what I was saying earlier, which is I think they should be spending enough to create full employment. So we should be going back to the sort of post-war attitude to unemployment, where the Curtin government at the end of World War II said that the government can and should use its spending power to fill the gap in private expenditure such that the economy is at full employment. And that's what I think. So I don't know what that number is, but I think carefully targeted government expenditure that aims to achieve full employment, that's accompanied by the appropriate spending on education and infrastructure, because you can achieve full employment and then you cause inflation because there are other limits, constraints on the economy through infrastructure and sort of the distribution of goods and services. But yeah, that's my short answer to that question. And the answer to that is much more than they are spending, and that we shouldn't be worried about the resulting government debt. it really is not an issue, right? We had massive government debt at the end of World War II, and the governments of both stripes for the following 25 years ran essentially constant deficits, and we never ran into a sovereign debt problem because it's sort of it's a fallacy, you know, that the government is
why
like.
do they keep going on about it though? They keep going on and on about it.
Yeah, I know, and so does Labor. Labor's been sort of trapped by this more or less since the successful attacks on Whitlam, I think. But the coalition keep going on and on about it because they can use government debt as an excuse to shrink the size of government, cut services, cut taxes, you know, increase flexibility in the labour force, which they're already talking about doing again.
And support the trickle-up economy, which supports wealthy people.
It suits their agenda, which is to sort of reduce the size of government, which, you know, the power and space that government holds is then replaced by private enterprise.
So the only thing,
John had a question, I think.
Is ideology, isn't it? They can do it, but it's just their ideology that's stopping them.
Yep. There's two sides to it, and one is just the issue of a carbon price, which, as I talked about earlier, it sort of distributes the burden both sort of economically and intellectually. So you put a price on carbon, you're just incentivizing everyone to think of ways to reduce that cost.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the key driver, is that you're distributing the mental energy and the creativity, and by passing it on to everyone. And the other side of it is the dividend, which and this is perhaps slightly less about efficiency and more about the sort of smoothness of the transition. You know, the dividend means that the moment you introduce the whole thing, prices for a whole lot of things go up, but you're handing people money so they can still afford those things. And so the transition happens at the fastest pace it can, but not in such a way that it's really destructive. So, you know, industry has a chance to, industries where there are no low carbon alternatives, people can still afford them. So, you know, petrol will be one of those things early on, right? There'll be a strong transition to move to electric cars, a strong incentive, but the supply might not be able to keep up. And, you know, so people who are stuck with petrol cars will still be able to afford the petrol. But meanwhile, there's an incentive on car makers to produce more electric cars or more efficient petrol vehicles. And there's, you know, and so the transition is smoother, I suppose. There's no great shock to the system because people have got the extra cash to afford the extra price.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our CCL channel by hitting the button in the top left-hand corner of this screen. Spread the word of CCL by using the share icon to as many of your contacts as possible. Thank you. See you next video.